Good morning. Appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning to meet with the Iowa Rivers and Waterways Study Committee. Jim Gillespie with the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Stewardship Division of Soil Conservation. And wanted to share some information with you about some of the things that we have done within the department related to rivers, waterways, and the issues associated with it. I think to just reflect a little bit on some history here, looking back at the conservation programs in Iowa, a lot of our efforts have been targeted on the upland landscape, putting conservation practices up on the landscape, intercepting the water where it falls, trying to hold it up on the landscape in the upland areas. And so by doing terraces, waterways, grade stabilization structures, those types of things, we've typically addressed more of the upland, which in turn has had an impact on the rivers, streams, creeks, from the standpoint of water that ultimately reaches those. And we started with the Kasha program back in 1973 and continued to put conservation practices on land across the whole state that impacts a lot of our waters. Some other things that we've done in cooperation with some of the other conservation partners, as discussed earlier, particularly the federal government, when we look at the PL 566 or Public Law 566 or the 534 program, which were for flood and erosion control, looking at putting grade stabilization structures up in the landscape. The Public Law 534 was the Little Sioux watershed efforts in western Iowa that looked at building multiple structures, and I think there are well over 400 structures built in western Iowa that were built under that federal program to hold the water back up in the watershed so that it protected those downstream rivers, creeks, and streams. The PL 566 actually extends around into southwest, southeast, and into the northeast part of Iowa, up into the Winnesheets and Alma Key for flood and erosion control as well, which impacts what happens downstream. In 1989, we actually started a watershed program with some special funding prior to the Resource Enhancement Protection Program, which came along in 1990, that offered us the opportunity to look at working in watersheds across the state to deal with water quality issues, but yet at the same time we dealt with some of the issues related to other watershed impacts. What you have in front of you is a map that would indicate all of the current active projects around the state. It tells you and codes by color the different, on the front, the mechanisms that fund those projects, and the pages immediately behind them list those projects. Now I would tell you that if we looked at the title of the project, you can determine probably by the title if it's creek or whatever river, it's going to be a project that does impact the stream, creek, or river. Others are usually lake-type things that do have an impact ultimately on those rivers and streams, but you can see there's a list of numerous projects. Since 1989, we have been involved with the conservation partners, USDA, NRCS, the Department of Natural Resources, other local organizations, and of course ultimately with the landowners to put conservation practices on in over 235 watershed projects. And in those projects we've done a lot of conservation practices, mostly again on the upland, but on the other hand we have gotten down into the streams, creeks, and channels in some of those projects to do some work directly related to that. In 1999, we came along with the Watershed Protection Fund, which was an initiative that started through through the legislature and stuff, and then of course in 2013 with the Water Quality Initiative, and I'll come back to that. When we look at watershed projects particularly, and I'm going to concentrate on those, we start with a watershed assessment. And we use what's called a RASCL, and unfortunately we tend to use a lot of acronyms. So I wrote this down, and I won't challenge you all to catch on this, but RASCL stands for the Rapid Assessment of Stream Corridor Along Its Length. So that's RASCL. And so in the process, and it was touched on by one of the previous presenters, our watershed coordinators actually in those watersheds go out and walk those creek and stream channels and do an assessment of what's physically happening in those streams and creek channels. And they'll note those on a RASCL tablet, which puts it into a database, which basically looks at erosion from degradation of the stream bottom, what's happening on the stream banks. It'll identify where some of the inflows are and some of the impacts that are actually happening in those streams, which then becomes part of the application process to, are there issues within the stream itself that need to be addressed? Are there some downcuttings, some overfalls that need to be addressed? Are there some raw banks that need to be addressed? And then how do we go back and address those, and what impacts would they have on those streams? And they'll walk and physically document everything that happens within those streams and creeks. Then we look at how we can improve that. When we think about this, and it was touched on by, again, the previous presenters, our river systems, streams, creeks, and channels are all different. We talked about some that had hard base to the channels. We talked about some that don't have a hard substrate to those channels. And you can look at northeast Iowa that would tend to have that limestone base to it. Then you can get to the western Iowa that doesn't have that limestone base. And so you see, particularly in western Iowa, continual downcutting, which then in turn causes bank sloughing and so on. And those of you who are here would remember that we do fund some projects in the Les Hills or the Hungry Canyons to look at trying to stabilize some of those downcutting streams in the western part of the state, as we've done in the University of Sitka, which was the Southern Iowa Development and Conservation Authority, to look at helping to protect some of those streams, creeks, and rivers in the southern and southeast part. But there's a difference in what happens and then what happens in those systems. All has to be addressed. Some of us might remember, it probably goes back way before our times even, that there was a lot of stream straightening, creeks, those types of things, stream straightening that went on historically. And some of those issues are causing impacts that we're trying to deal with today as those streams start to re-meander and that type of stuff. So we have to look at those. The cold water streams in northern Iowa, we've been involved in several of those. You can see some of those identified on the map. I would say that's probably where we've probably done the most in-stream work when we talk about stream bank stabilization and stuff. We've done that in turn in partnering with particularly the Department of Natural Resources and the fisheries folks. So when we can incorporate stream bank stabilization into those, we also looked at creating fish habitat. I think Mike talked about putting trout hides in and stuff. We've worked very closely with them to do that. When we go in and develop these practices, we try to adhere to a common standard and specification when we do those, because we want to ensure to the landowners and the applicants that we're putting a practice in that's going to satisfy the need, that's going to stand there and last into the future and not cut away or erode away. And those can even be used on basic engineering standards. But we look at, if we can, armor arming the toe, as indicated earlier, then trying to either stabilize the bank with willows. We also use cedar revetments at times. I know we had a project in Jackson County a few years ago where we actually got an interim standard from the Natural Resource Conservation Service to basically go in and just use cedar revetments to stabilize the banks. We couldn't get back into the area to haul the hard rock material to armor the toe. And to my knowledge, those cedar revetment areas are still standing and have stabilized those stream banks in there with that interim standard that we were granted. So we continue to do that. I think when we look at streams, creeks, and rivers, as you're fully aware, there are times we have to address things more maybe from an infrastructure need than a resource need. And when I say infrastructure need, those of you that would remember the floods of '93, where we had a lot of roads that were threatened because bridges and approaches to those where streams crossed, we had to go in and stabilize those to save the infrastructure of the bridges that were threatened by cuts in those streams and rivers. There are a lot of those things, utilities and others, railroad tracks, other things that get impacted by degradation of streams, banks, and channels that have to be addressed, as well as looking at the resources. How do we stabilize the downcutting? How do we stabilize the bank sloughing or the cutting? And those can happen for a lot of different reasons. I know one of the slides that I think Nate had in his showed where the cornfield was sloughing off. That happens to be in the Nishnabotna River in southwest Iowa. I can also tell you that it isn't necessarily always just cropland that sloughs off into the river. I can take you to a county park just north of Griswold on the same river system that it cut clear back up and in fact cut through a concrete road by the bank sloughing off into the Nishnabotna River. It's just the activities that occur and the things that can happen. These rivers and streams can be very energized and can have huge impacts on all of the resources. Again, we need some good standards and specifications and engineering standards in order to do these things so that we're giving people the best practices that we can put on the land. Anytime we do something in a stream or a river, it's a cause and effect. If you do something here, what's the impact downstream? Have we increased the energy of the flow of the river? What's its impact on ultimate bends and curves or downcutting? A prime example, and I know Bruce Troutman's here from the DNR, the deputy director up there, when he was in southeast Iowa working for the Natural Resource Conservation Service, we partnered with the federal government to put a stream channel stabilization project on the Fox River just below Mount Sterling, Iowa, to stabilize that river system, because the straightening of the Fox had basically hit the meandering, non-straightened part in the Missouri section and was causing, about a 30-foot overfall to move back up through that river system that, had it reached the state of Iowa, would have caused one tremendous unraveling system. And that stabilization project has been in place probably close to 10 years now and has protected the resources of the state of Iowa. But it's those types of partnerships that have helped make these types of projects very, very successful. I think some of these were touched on by Mike and Nate, and you'll hear these probably multiple times throughout the day as your committee moves forward and as you look at challenges. I would say that there are probably 6 main things we need to focus on in stream and waterway efforts. I think we need to stop the downcutting. We need to figure out how to stop the downcutting. We need to figure out a way to slope back the vertical banks and figure out a way that we can slope those back and stabilize them. I think we need to armor the toe and basically prevent that for the bounce of the river, to protect that part that's going to get impacted the most by the creek, river, or stream. We need to armor that toe. I think we need to protect and build a floodplain. And floodplains are floodplain has always served as a tremendous need to the river and creek systems, so we need to protect those floodplains. They function, they were put there for a purpose, and we need to protect them. We need to look at the re-meandering of streams. What's the impacts of re-meandering? Because it does slow it down. Channelization causes it to flow much faster, causes more downcutting. If we can figure out how to re-meander, we can do that. And I think the last is we need to establish a deep-rooted prairie vegetation along those stream banks and channels. Doesn't mean we eliminate all of the forestry infrastructure in that riparian, but I think we need that deep-rooted prairie vegetation with intermixed trees throughout in order to stabilize it. I'm sure you saw pictures in some of the earlier presentations where trees were standing on the edges and the roots were exposed. Those roots didn't grow out into that channel naturally. The erosion occurred around them. So tree roots don't always naturally hold those banks, whereas that deep-rooted vegetation can do a better, prairie vegetation can do a better job. I think if we can do these things, we can help protect the rivers, streams, and waterways of this state. And so if we can do those 6 things, I think we'll make tremendous strides to move this forward. With that, I would conclude my report and answer any questions you may have. Oh, one last thing. Those of you remember the show. We talked about the urban setting, and that's something that we've gotten involved in. The Secretary has put a focus on working on the urban issues, and we have issues related to those streams and channels within the urban areas that are a tremendous need. And sometimes those are very limiting because, as shown in the previous slides, houses and infrastructure goes right up to stream banks. And I could probably take you to sections of Des Moines where people have tied trees to decks of their houses trying to hold them from falling into the river or the creek or the stream. And I'm like, do they really understand that that's not going to hold? Something's going to give, and it's probably the deck or something. But we've done some work. It's hard to re-meander those. It's hard to slope them back because I think, as Nate showed in one of his slides, the cut was pretty close to the house itself. But we need to figure out how to do that. We need to work with future development so that we don't encroach upon those stream banks and rivers to protect those. So with that, I would conclude my presentation and answer any questions that any of the committee members might have.
Senator Johnson. I don't mean to dominate the discussion here. I do have some questions. I've been working with ATV, this younger generation doesn't know about waterways. When you, I want to just ask you a question about your final point here. So, on a technical basis, having some kind of deep-rooted prairie vegetation along the stream bank with row crops or not necessarily row crops are, what's the distance away from that stream where that would be effective? I mean, is there an answer to that question?
I'm not sure I have the technical answer. I mean, as much as we can buffer that, the better. Of course, part of that would depend on if we can slope that back. But I think we want to try to stabilize that. And of course, if it's in the floodplain, it's going to make a difference. Because once it gets out of the banks and starts to scour, that root system will tend to hold it. I think you'll see some slides later today of water that's traversed over some native vegetation, and it just tends to flatten it, and then it'll come back up, whereas you can get to another part that doesn't have that, and it'll start to scour it pretty quickly. I don't have, Senator Johnson, I don't have the technical aspect of what that is. I mean, when we think of CRP and stuff, it's buffers are 60 feet, 120 feet, or whatever. I think any buffer we can get to any width, the farther we can get, the better. But I think any type of buffering we can get to buffer that edge is good.
I'm going to pass this around. I had Tim McDermott email
this for you, here's a printout. There's an example of that in the Little Sioux River. Give you comment on the relationship between the money we're spending on lake restoration, especially with dredging, and watersheds. Of course, we're going to discuss that later. Well, I just think there is a relationship. I mean, we're spending a lot of money on dredging.
Yeah, and I think, and that's one thing I didn't mention either is in our watershed projects, and Mike, I think, is on the program later today, we're partnering a lot on lake restoration projects for our watershed standpoint, because when we can address issues in the watershed above that can protect the lake that's getting restored or whatever, that's a great partnership that can fit together. And so I think as those things tend to develop, we partner as much as we can on those projects throughout the state.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike, thank you for your presentation. I could dominate this conversation also because there's a lot to talk about. But I want, Nate is a great advocate for our Rivers and Streams program, and he's done a tremendous amount of work in the state of Iowa, besides the books he's put together on guides on all our rivers and the trips that people can take. So this committee, he did say one thing, and this is probably more for a discussion at the end about we need to work to restore our rivers and streams so we can attract the workforce of tomorrow. And I really think that's a big thing. And so the issues that you talked about making sure that some of the steps we need to do are very important. And it hit home to me in the very last one, with talking about prairie restoration. And David, your answer to that question is right up to the stream bank and into the river on the prairie grass buffer. I studied native prairies under Dr. Darrell Smith at the Tallgrass Prairie Center in the University of Northern Iowa. That's right down in marine biology. So I really focused on native grasses and their values. And one of the things that I haven't really seen yet, but we'll probably talk a little bit more about it, not only with water quality, with siltation and bank structures and fishing, really is the water quality of the water itself and what kind of nutrients are in there. And native grasses can play a very important role in that. So one of the things that we did under the Culver administration and the Power Fund wasn't necessarily related towards streams and rivers, but they are currently doing research at the University of Northern Iowa to try to plan and figure out what's the best kind of prairie mix that you can plant on a farm to produce the most amount of biomass. And that was in conjunction with using prairie grasses as a fuel source. And at Cedar Falls, it's not my district, but they have an old shaker furnace, and they were burning a variety of materials, switchgrass and wood pellets and those kind of things. And what we were working with at the University of Northern Iowa, and the legislature supported it, it was the only thing that the legislature voted on in the Power Fund that the committee didn't directly do, was this native grass restoration. And the side effects of this thing is that in order for us to really have the economic ability to be able to clean our rivers and streams up, to be able to do the kind of things with the bank erosion that I believe native grasses can help with is that these things had cash flow. And our farming friends had to be able to, when they put in buffer strips, be able to make something off of it. And we were working with and had conversations with Ag Secretary Tom Vilsack about the set-aside program. And Dr. Smith believes that what we could do with this set-aside program with native grasses is to plant them and allow farmers to harvest that set-aside, which they currently can't do for grasses, once every couple 3 years. Those set-aside strips along our rivers and streams would have a variety of positive effects. One would give our farmers an additional crop, at the same time filtering out the nutriments that we see in excessive runoff from nitrogen use and other fertilizers. I participated in the Midwest Environmental Forum on the Mississippi, and the dead zone this year is tremendous boom because of we put so much fertilizer in the ground the previous years, and then last spring we had all that runoff that went down the rivers and ended up in the Gulf, and that's really the dead zone is getting bigger and bigger. So it's a serious problem. But back to the prairie, that will help filter that. It helps the siltation. We can help the farmers with additional crop, and I truly believe that the legislature ought to help finance the planning of some of these buffer strips around, especially sensitive areas and rivers and streams, because a person who lives in the city is going to benefit, because I use the river. I live on the Cedar River. I canoe and kayak the Cedar River, and I see more and more islands using our rivers and streams more than they ever had. I moved on my piece of property 18 years ago, just prior to going in the legislature. And if I saw a canoeist or a kayaker down the Cedar River in front of my property, it was a rare thing. Last summer, there were endless groups of individuals, kayaking groups, students, young professionals, packs of 20 kayakers on the Cedar. Iowans want this recreation, and they and it's something that I think we need to continue to develop and put resources in to enhance our rivers and streams. So this is a long statement. I'm going on here, but I didn't know when the place I was going to jump in. But you give me the lead on this native grass stuff because it's important, but it's expensive. And just saying that, okay, we need to do this, well, it's going to take a partnership. Farmers will benefit, but there is cost to do it. We got to work with the federal partners on it, with the set aside and cost sharing stuff. And I really believe that Iowans ought to help support these kind of initiatives. So I don't know if you want to comment on my tirade here, but
no, I think I appreciate those comments, and it's probably something I forgot to touch on, and particularly related to the water quality initiative. Buffers or seedings is part of that initiative moving forward that can have some direct nutrient benefits, nutrient reduction benefits, and I think we'll continue to look at those as we move forward with that strategy. And the types of things, and in some of our projects and through some of our programs, we are doing some buffering. We do enhance the CRP through the CRP initiative program that comes through the legislature to do that. Now the CRP limits the use of that as an alternative. It's just an annual rental payment. But any place we can do that, because we're not sure exactly, we haven't completely done the studies to determine that, but we believe that there's a lot of legacy nutrients along those streams, rivers, channels, and stuff that will move down through the system. It isn't all just coming off the upland, that there's legacy nutrients in those that we need to make sure we hold there or utilize or trap. So it will be important to do those things in the banks, channels, and stuff that we can to hold those nutrients from moving on down the system. So all of it interrelates and fits very well together. So thank you.
Jim, you mentioned re-meandering the streams, and every year we tend to put more and more money. It seems like it's an endless flow of money into hungry canyons. Is there any ideas there where we could re-meander those streams and actually take care of the problem that lost soil is just going to keep digging deeper, no matter what you do. Those streams were channelized probably, around the turn of the last century?
There was probably, and John probably could relate to this more than I can, but there have been a lot of issues going on out there. The channelization, the straightening of of those streams and creeks. The whole issue is related to the Missouri River that have caused each of those tributaries that drains into the Missouri to try to meet an equilibrium. That's caused a lot of the down cutting as it's moved back up in. When you hear the M&M divide, the Mississippi and Missouri, which runs somewhere around Adair, Iowa. And what's west of Adair flows to the Missouri, and what's east of the Adair flows to the Mississippi. You know, I don't know when we'll come to a point where some of those are getting pretty close to Adair, Iowa. It might cut through and we could see flow going the other way or something. I don't know, but it is, and the degradation probably is in some cases greater than the bank stabilization, but it's more the sloughing off from the degradation than it is the one to re-meander. Would that be a fair assessment, John? You know, so because the down cutting is happening at such a fast rate, the banks start to slough off. And so, you know, re-meander may not be the quickest solution to it as to try to stabilize the drops in the channel itself.
Do you believe that should be a long-term goal?
Water will do interesting things. I'm not a scientist, but rivers will typically try to re-meander when they reach a certain point. I mean,
I'm concerned with building the new Grand Canyon in western Iowa. You know, it's less fun, it's just dust.
Yeah, I mean, I've been to meetings out there where people will be at the same meetings remember being able to jump across. And now, they've had to put 2 and 3 extensions on bridges to get across because the bridge isn't longer anymore because it's getting wide.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.